Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review. The book that we are looking at this time is by Karen Armstrong. Came out in 2022, and it is called Sacred Nature: Restoring Our Ancient Bond with the Natural World. And it's essentially a book that is making some arguments and providing some, let's call them insights and practices within the realm of comparative or world religions, something that falls within my wheelhouse because I've been teaching world religions as a staple class all of my career as a professor. And it falls within the scope of the Honest Book Reviews because we generally look at philosophy writ large, which includes religious perspectives. This also is a book of ethics as well. So we're going to jump right in looking at the three S's, then we'll talk about some of the key ideas, some of the good points of the book, and some of the aspects that I found problematic. The three S's are style, structure, summary, some of the stuff you really want to know right off the bat. And we'll say that this is, essentially a chapter book. There is an overarching argument or contention or program to it. And we get an introduction, we get an epilogue, kind of bookending things. And then we get 10 main short chapters, each of which is going to talk about some religious perspectives, what we can draw from them, contrast them with some other religious perspectives or secular perspectives, and finish each of these chapters with the way forward, suggesting some insights that we can incorporate, some practices that we can apply within our life. There is also, interestingly, an acknowledgments part after the epilogue. There's some pretty detailed notes in some parts of it, mostly providing, the bibliography, you could say. And there is also a select bibliography and index to it. So, this is essentially a trade paperback by an academic who has written a lot of books for the general public within her field of, we could call it, comparative and engaged religion. And, what is the overall or overarching point to the book? Well, it kind of gives it away in the title, Restoring Our Ancient Bond with the Natural World. So clearly, at least in certain parts of the world, we'll say, we've lost our bond with the natural world. We consider ourselves outside of nature or opposed to nature. And we can turn to ideas, insights, less often practices, from a variety of different perspectives, kind of taking what we need from them to change that, to have a better viewpoint on this. And most of these are being drawn from traditional religious conceptions. I will say, so this is kind of a good summary of what is going on in the book. Early on in the introduction, there's this discussion of changing our aesthetic relation with nature. And then she says, our changed relationship with nature is not just an aesthetic loss. Over many years now, we've become increasingly aware of the damage we are inflicting on the natural environment and its potentially drastic impact on human life. So, talking about climate change, pollution, matters like that, and how this could be an actual existential threat to not just human meaning, but the human existence in general. And so maybe this other previous paradigm found in a lot of other places could be what we need to engage with in order to make it into, the next century or even another millennium. She talks about there being an environmental crisis that's attained new urgency. So that's really on a lot of people's minds at this point in time. And she talks about sort of a secularization of our approach to nature. And she's going to claim that the view of the divine that she's aiming at combating is unique to the modern West. So deeply ingrained is the idea of the sacrality, that is, holiness of nature, that although people throughout the world have embraced Western science and technology, adopted Western forms of government, and followed the West by exploiting the natural world, this narrow perception of the divine has never been wholly accepted in other religions. Many non-Western people still don't comprehend the full implications of our secular concept of nature. And so the idea is that, the West has introduced a kind of crisis that we need to, find our way out of. And she's going to draw on a lot of different sources, some of which are coming from the monotheistic, religions of Abraham, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but there's a lot of engagement with Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, a little bit with Jainism. So we've got, Chinese and, Indian subcontinent religions well represented. Not a lot of discussion of indigenous religions, mostly, those being looked at. But it makes sense if you think about it, given that these are some of the bigger representative religions and part of some very important cultural spheres. Now, the last thing I'll say, since I've already given you sort of structure and summary, it's a very readable book. Armstrong is a well-established author, so, no big surprise that the book is eminently suited to a general audience. If you read it, she's going to provide you with explanations of what she's talking about. Don't expect a lot of depth to the work because, it's pretty short, so you're getting little samples and snippets out of text. There's just 174 pages of text, and you notice, it's pretty short pages as well, so there's not a ton of content there, but there's enough that if you're not familiar with some of these religious traditions, you might actually, learn quite a bit along the way. So what are some of the key ideas of the work? I'm going to begin by talking about something that you could say overall structures the work as a whole and the argument of the work. We've got I won't say a lot, but a few really key dichotomies. And a dichotomy is where you say there's this on this side, there's this on this side, and generally there's going to be and we like this over here and don't like this over here. So, you've got modern Western secular versus basically everybody else, including pre-modern Western religious, to some degree, depends on what we're looking at. And then we also have this big contrast that's actually the title of the first chapter between mythos and logos, with mythos being good, logos not being quite so good, being a bit problematic. And I'll point out that ironically the book is really a big composition of what she's calling logos more than mythos, but perhaps that's a bit unavoidable. So, she's going to tell us that for most of human history, there were two ways of thinking, speaking, and acquiring knowledge about the world: mythos and logos. Both were essential to comprehending reality. They were not in opposition to one another, but complementary modes of arriving at truth, and each had its special area of competence. Mythos was concerned with what was considered timeless. It looked back to the origins of life and culture and inward to the deepest levels of human experience. It was concerned with meaning, not practical affairs. She goes on and talks about meaning-seeking creatures. And then, what is logos? It's very different than mythical thinking. It corresponds to objective facts. It's wholly pragmatic, the rational mode of thought that enables human beings to function, the basis of our modern society. Okay, so this is, an interesting contrast that's going on here. We're also going to see it mentioned and invoked in the epilogue as well. talking about a contrast between, here we go, Kabbalists, Muslims, Christians, Confucians, Taoists, and Hindus over centuries. They managed this engagement with nature, not by scientific study, but through creativity and art with rituals, poetry, music, and bodily gestures that have a profound effect on mental life. And so, again, we've got the logos, mythos thing represented there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the problematic aspects of this. But let's move on. So there's another important assertion that's being made here about dichotomies, and that is that we have monotheism that is a great exception to religious ways of seeing things, and that by itself is not enough to get us to a nature that's not sacred as we want to see it. But she says, in early modern Europe, the link between nature and the divine was severed. Christians began to see God as separate from the world. Originally, European Christians, like the peoples of the Middle East, India, and China, had seen the sacred as a ubiquitous force that pervaded the natural world and pulled the disparate elements of the universe together. She uses Thomas Aquinas as an example of this. God was not confined to a supernatural heaven, but was present everywhere in everything. This is what we call divine immanence. And then she says Thomas's theology was to be superseded with a radical shift in the Western conception of the divine. By the 14th century, students at the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were studying logic, mathematics, and Aristotelian science before they began their theological studies, and when they arrived in divinity school, they were so well versed in logical thought they instinctively tried to describe theological issues in rational terms. So she singles out John Duns Scotus, and we get a complete break between the secular and the sacred. Now, is that a true account of the rise of Western scholasticism and what they believed? Maybe not. But it is an interesting story nonetheless. And then we kind of move on. The idea is we need to recover sacred nature. And there's an entire chapter called Sacred Nature, which has an interesting discussion of Chinese culture and religious ideas, beginning with talking about the Tao and non-creation, you could say, and then seminal forces or qi. By qi, Fang Yiji was referring to the essence of being. She says qi challenged and still challenges Western ideas. And that the Jesuits are seeing a gulf between human and divine worlds, but the Chinese that they're encountering don't actually see this. And then there's, some discussions of the Confucian sage and Mencius, the Golden Rule, which we're going to talk about, Lao Tzu, Taoism, Zhuangzi, and all of these sorts of things that are kind of commonplace to discussions of Chinese religion, at least. And, it runs through the chapter, and there's a good bit of compare and contrast. This could be connected with Vedanta. This could be connected with, the Vedas and the Rishis. This could also be connected with the Kabbalah, with Zen Buddhism, and you kind of get the idea there. But what we want is a sort of recovery of sacred nature. In the next chapter, the holiness of nature. How can we actually see nature as holy? She starts talking here about Hebrew scriptures and how the sacred is being understood in say poetry like the Psalms or the Deuteronomical books and their writings, the wisdom literature, and then there's a lot of discussion of what we can get out of one of the preeminent works of what's called the wisdom literature, the book of Job, which is quite a bit about nature. And she's talking about the different arguments and images that are being made there as well. There is an interesting discussion about, it's in a chapter called Our Broken World, of what we could call our dark and damaged side of life. She says, we're constantly inundated with accounts of tragedy, sorrow, and cruelty. And so how does religion, through stories and rituals, engage these matters, particularly in the realm of nature? And she talks about there being a deliberate evocation of grief for the damaged world at the heart of Aryan or Indian religion, which, you'd think it also would encompass Zoroastrianism and, some of the, what we often call pagan Western religions. And then she jumps into a very interesting discussion of the Quran and recitation and what goes on and how it can be an art form, evoking a state known as huzn, meaning sorrow, grief, or plaintiveness, right? She talks about some hadiths and some Muslim mystics and all of those sorts of things, and then also talks about Isaac Luria and his creation story that is about a broken world as well. And then the next chapter has to do with, it's called Sacrifice, and it begins by talking about animal sacrifice, which was essential in all sorts of religions, not just animal sacrifice, also, fruits, grains, things like that, and how that was, over time, rethought, converted, turned into a focus less on externals and more on the internal state of the person. She brings up a few points that, you might find interesting, talking about, changing the sacrifices as the dreaded moment approached. This is talking about Hindu sacrifices. The animals, or Vedic sacrifices. The animal's pardon was asked for, and other members of its species were begged not to take revenge. After the slaughter, the victim, now liberated from the profane world, was sanctified. And sacrifice is certainly an important part of a lot of religions, particularly ancient religions. There's a chapter on kenosis, which means emptying or sort of like losing yourself within something else, sacrificing yourself, which, makes sense that it comes after that. And then there is some very interesting discussion in the chapter on gratitude about Islam and the Quran and gratitude to God for the natural world. We get a very interesting discussion in the next section about the Israelites and the prophets and how that plays out. And then we get a chapter on the Golden Rule, which we're going to talk about again in the problematic part, focused a lot on Confucianism, discussing Confucius himself, discussing Mencius, and talking about Neo-Confucianism, which is a movement within Chinese thought that attempts to engage what they thought of as good insights coming from Buddhism and from Taoism, a much more cosmological way of looking at things. And, Armstrong is even going to discuss for a page or two a few, Confucian ideas in the present, although that most of that's going to come later. Then we get a chapter on what's usually translated as nonviolence or harmlessness, ahimsa, and that's going to look a lot more at Indian stuff. This is where we get a mention, actually not just a mention, but several pages discussing Mahavira and Jainism, which is a very important dharmic religion in India, but doesn't have quite the base that Hinduism and Buddhism have developed. It was quite important in the past. Then there's some discussion of one of the Hindu national epics, the Mahabharata, and how nonviolence can play out in this as well. And the final chapter is called Concentric Circles. here again, we come to look at Neo-Confucianism, at Buddhism, and this notion of expanding from one's own small circle of, say, the family, outward to potentially all of human beings and even the natural world of animals, plants, and ecosystems. So, there's a lot of interesting ideas that are being raised here. And then the epilogue is going to bring up Samuel Coleridge, and in particular, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So Wordsworth and Coleridge are kind of representatives for Armstrong of what it is, the viewpoint that she wants to convey and have us develop. So those are some of the main points made in this volume, this little short book that is trying to make the case that we need to have a mind shift change. We need to take the resources that we're finding in these various religious traditions, along with some Westerners, like, say, poets or mystics, and develop a new way of understanding ourselves in relation to other human beings and nature. So what are some good points about this work? I think that, if you're not an expert in comparative or world religions, you're going to learn some things along the way about, Confucianism, Taoism, various forms of Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Jainism, a few other things here and there. And, it's a fairly broad, and I would say in terms of world religions, representative engagement with the resources that religions offer to us. I also do like the fact that she does end each chapter with some suggestions about what we can do, how we can incorporate these into our life, drawing some practical implications from these various religious teachings or traditions, or as she's going to call them, mythos. It in effect winds up making this not quite into a philosophy as a way of life volume. It maybe doesn't have quite enough for that, but certainly the starts of it, right? And she does have other books where she addresses things like that, like 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. So she doesn't have to do exactly what she did in one book in another. She does engage in some decent comparison and contrast between different traditions. She's a competent scholar of world religions who's been doing this for a number of years and is, pretty well regarded in that respect. It's, there is a tendency to like everything non-Western is pretty much good. There's a lot you could say that doesn't get addressed. And then it's not just so simple as, well, non-Western is good, Western is bad, because there are quite a few aspects of Western religion, from Judaism and Christianity. We could even lump Islam in there as well as, a monotheistic Abrahamic religion that she does bring to light. She loves mystics, not a surprise. Armstrong has always been kind of that sort of leaning, you could say. It's interesting to see her harness Thomas Aquinas there. And, there's a nice little discussion, compare and contrasting different biblical books and the mindsets behind them. So on the one hand, we have like the Deuteronomical, it's about power and structure, versus the wisdom literature, which includes the Psalms and Job. And then there's the prophetic literature, which she's quite attentive to as well, which is, oriented towards what we nowadays call social justice. Book of Amos, prime example that she mentions there. And there's a surprisingly, numerous engagements with Islam, thinking about, what is going on in praying or chanting in community, in reading the Quran, and stuff like that. So it's kind of a overall sympathetic approach to stuff. I expect that, as I mentioned before, if you don't know an awful lot, say, about Chinese religions or the Dharmic religions of the Indian subcontinent, you'll probably learn a good bit on the way in reading this book. So those are some positive aspects to the work. What did I find problematic about the book? And that may not be what you as a reader find problematic, but I do have to point these out. And they're not just quibbles. There are some deep issues. I think that setting up the dichotomy of logos and mythos in the way that she's doing is a little bit irresponsible and pretty inaccurate. It lends itself to certain modes of thinking that this is just going to reinforce, that I don't think are particularly serving people who view things that way. There's a few, I won't call them villains, but let's call them unfairly and reductively presented figures in the book. And as you can guess, one of them is René Descartes. So she says, Descartes' famous maxim, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was, he argued, the only point of certainty which nothing in the external world could provide. For Descartes, the modern mind, and deliberately retreated from nature, it should be solitary, autonomous, and a world unto itself, unaffected by and separate from all other beings. And because the material universe was lifeless, godless, and inert, nature could tell us nothing about God, the ultimate reality. In Descartes' writings, there is none of the awe that had informed traditional views of the sacred. Indeed, it was the task of science to dispel such reverence. Well, yes, cogito ergo sum, that is there, but it's as if she stopped reading the meditations at meditation 2, which a lot of people do, and didn't bother to read the rest of the works, or she just read, somebody else's disparaging views on Descartes, which I suspect may actually be the case. Descartes has a lot of discussions about God. And yes, God is not there in the world of extension, but we're not totally on our own. I mean, maybe somebody should read Descartes' correspondence with Princess Elizabeth about the mind and the body and see the connection that he has to at least one other person in the world, which spurred him to write The Passions of the Soul, which is exploring the emotions and stuff like that. And, Descartes' God, okay, there's some debate about what role does God actually play, but to say that Descartes doesn't have any awe towards God, that strikes me as a little bit unfair. And, Descartes comes up again later on as well when she's praising Coleridge. Coleridge did not experience a deity confined to heaven like the God of Newton or Descartes. I don't see Descartes saying that God is confined to heaven. So where is that coming from? So, if you're going to bash somebody, you got to be fair to them rather than making them kind of a boogeyman. Otherwise, people are like, what's going on here, right? And that's just one of the most egregious examples. I think this logos mythos thing, she's not even consistent with it. A lot of what she's doing in here is explicitly logos. Before she was saying, logos is eternal and timeless, and yet somehow it's also like the day-to-day rituals and stuff. You kind of can't have it both ways. So, it's got a lot of rhetorical force, but I don't think it's a good way to make sense of things. I would say, as somebody who has spent a lot of time researching, teaching about, reading things pertaining to Chinese religions, that the treatment of Taoism and Confucianism is a little bit on the... Actually, I'll take that back. It's not a little bit. It's almost exclusively on the let's read the texts and generalize from that, with almost no engagement whatsoever with these religions as living systems, as ongoing ways in which human beings approach the world and each other. Okay, so Confucianism has always been a little bit more philosophical, but Taoism, I mean, this is all Daojia, no Daojiu, no actual what people who identify as Taoists practice, with the exception of one very, very short discussion of quiet sitting, emptying the mind of preconceived ideas and making it more receptive to outside influences. And then it immediately jumps into Chinese Buddhists. So very little stuff about practice or community, a lot about philosophical texts. The treatment of Indian religion, maybe not quite so much in that line. I mean, if you can look at phenomenologically what's going on when you're reading the Quran, why not do that with what's going on when you're reading Confucian texts and trying to apply them, I would say. The treatment of Buddhism in this is, as you can expect from a lot of Western scholars, especially those of a certain generation that I would say Armstrong, belongs to. Is there a lot of discussion of the most common form of Buddhism, Pure Land? No, it's Zen. It's other things that are a little bit more trendy and better known. So I'm not real happy with the representation here. I would say some of the chapters are kind of misnamed, like the kenosis chapter. I mean, that's a Christian idea, part of theology, and sure, you can extend it to Hindu stuff and to the Tao, I suppose, but you're really kind of stretching things there. There's a good bit of shoehorning. Is no self or anatta the same thing as kenosis? Maybe not. So I don't know about that. The Golden Rule chapter, this is kind of strange. So it begins with discussion of Confucianism, and then goes into Neo-Confucianism a little bit later. And typically we distinguish between the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is positive, from the Silver Rule, don't do to others what you don't want them to do unto you. And Armstrong just blurs those together and calls them both the Golden Rule. And, the explicit text that she brings up for how Ren, this key virtue in Confucianism, is actually lived out. She says, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. That's the Silver Rule. It's not the Golden Rule. And we make a distinction between that. Totally missing here. She knows the difference between these. So you wonder, well, what's going on here? So, that's a bit of a problem, I would say. The last chapter, concentric circles, I'm not convinced at all that the texts that she is bringing up really express the idea of concentric circles. And these are texts that are coming up from, Confucian and Neo-Confucian literature. Now, it's clear that in Buddhism there is this, conception of concentric circles. That's there. It's also kind of suspect that she doesn't bring up others who definitely do talk about concentric circles, namely the Stoics, Heracles. This is a great Western example that she could have brought in and made some comparisons to. Peter Singer actually has a book, The Growing Circle, if I remember the name of it rightly, where utilitarians think about things in this way. So I'm a little bit, skeptical of her treatment of concentric circles, why it is, on the one hand, saying that some people actually have this idea when there's no textual, reference to circles there, and why she didn't talk about, she missed the opportunity to talk about Western sources that would have like reinforced her point. So those are my issues with it. I think that, you know, none of these are like absolutely wrong, other than the criticisms of Descartes. But they're kind of misleading. And if you relied on this, like you don't really know the text thinkers tradition she's talking about, you could get a bit misled. And I think that this is definitely not a book that you want as your final word about stuff. It could be useful for promoting discussion, perhaps. So those are my criticisms of the work. All right, final thoughts. I will give this work a qualified endorsement. I'm not a fan of it. And admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of Armstrong because I think similar problems with dichotomous, oversimplistic thinking do mar some of her other works. And that's a problem with this. But, you know, if you're not all that well versed in comparative or world religions, I think you could learn something from it. I am a little disappointed because I do think that the overall master claim that we need to have a better approach as a global culture to nature as a whole, really, you know, we do need that. We're clearly in a time of environmental crisis. I'm not quite so sold on the usefulness of all of these thinkers, text traditions that she's bringing up, but I'm, you know, open to it and reinterpreting what it is that other cultures and faiths have to bring to the table, I think is a good thing. So I think this could be an interesting book to check out, but perhaps it's better just to get it from your local library, which guaranteed, since she's such a big name, they probably have a recently acquired copy rather than going out and purchasing it yourself. So those are my final thoughts.